Dive into today's topic on the book of Genesis, let's take a moment to pause and pray together. Prayer helps us set the right intention and ask for wisdom and guidance as we learn. If you'd like, please join me in this short prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. As we explore the book of Genesis, please open our minds to understand and our hearts to receive your wisdom. Help us to learn, share, and grow in faith. Guide my words and be with everyone watching today. May your blessing and peace be with us all. Amen. In today's video, we're diving into the fascinating world of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible and one of the most influential texts in history. Whether you're interested in faith, history, literature, or philosophy, Genesis has something for you. We'll explore not only what Genesis says about creation, humanity, and God, but also how scholars study its origins, structure, and meaning through critical analysis. Get ready to discover how different traditions and ancient sources came together to shape this profound and complex book, and why its stories, from Adam and Eve to Abraham and Joseph, continue to inspire and challenge readers today. Critical study of the book of Genesis. The critical study of the book of Genesis involves examining its historical context, literary structure, theological themes, and textual composition using scholarly methods such as historical, literary, and source criticism. Here is a detailed overview. Historical critical perspective Genesis is analyzed within its ancient Near Eastern context, understanding it as a foundational theological text that purposely contrasts with pagan creation myths of surrounding cultures. The creation account in Genesis 1, for example, subverts the polytheistic narratives popular in ancient Egypt, Canaan, and Babylon by affirming a single, sovereign God who creates by divine decree rather than conflict among gods. This makes Genesis both a theological and cultural polemic of its time. Scholars also investigate the authorship and dating of Genesis, often attributing its final form to a composite work edited during or after the Babylonian exile. The book likely compiles multiple oral and written traditions into a structured narrative emphasizing beginnings, covenants, and God's relationship with humanity. Literary criticism Genesis is recognized for its sophisticated narrative artistry. The text employs various literary techniques such as chiasmus, a symmetrical literary structure, parallel narratives, and vivid character contrasts. For example, Genesis 38, which interrupts the Joseph story, is a standalone narrative with its own thematic significance, illustrating complex family and social dynamics. Additionally, the juxtaposition of the two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2 reveals different theological emphases. The first stresses the majestic, transcendent God and ordered creation, while the second focuses on intimacy, human origins, and relationships. Literary analysis highlights these purposeful differences to enrich theological understanding rather than seeing them as contradictions. Theological themes. Critical study pays attention to major theological themes such as creation, the fall, covenant, election, and the problem of evil. Genesis sets the stage for biblical salvation history, introducing typological connections to Christ and God's ongoing plan for humanity through covenant promises to figures like Noah and Abraham. These themes reflect canonical concerns and invite reading Genesis not only as an ancient text, but also as the theological foundation for the entire Bible. This canonical approach helps balance historical critical insights with faith-based interpretation. Source and form. Criticism Genesis contains multiple source strands, such as the distinct narrative styles in the flood account, indicating incorporation of various ancient traditions. This composite nature informs the study of Genesis as a text shaped by editorial processes, preserving authentic historical and theological memory. Form criticism identifies various genres within Genesis, for example, genealogies, narrative, legal material, that illuminate the original context and purpose of these texts before their compilation. Summary critical study of Genesis reveals it as a richly layered text that combines historical tradition, literary artistry, and profound theological messages. It challenges readers to appreciate its ancient context and compositional complexity while engaging its spiritual truths about God, creation, humanity, and redemption. This approach balances respect for the text's religious significance with careful scholarly inquiry into its origins and meaning. We're going to explore something truly fascinating: the Book of Genesis. If you've ever wondered about the origins of its stories, how it was written, and why it matters, you're in the right place. We'll be taking a critical look at Genesis, examining how scholars study its historical background, literary structure, and deep theological themes. Unlike a simple summary, this approach helps us see Genesis not just as ancient scripture, but as a complex work shaped by history, diverse writers, and powerful ideas. From contrasting pagan myths with one sovereign God, to the artistic way stories are woven together, Genesis offers layers of insight and meaning. We'll look at its creation accounts, dramatic family tales, and promises that stretch for generations. Whether you read Genesis for faith, curiosity, or academic interest, today you'll discover why this book continues to inspire debate and reflection. Let's get started. Composition and authorship. Traditional view. Genesis has long been attributed to Moses, who is believed in Jewish and Christian tradition to have compiled and written the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, from ancient sources and divine inspiration. Modern critical scholarship. Documentary hypothesis. Scholars now view Genesis as a composite work drawn from several distinct source traditions. The main sources identified, sometimes called the documentary hypothesis, are Yahwist. J. Uses the name Yahweh for God, features vivid narratives, and focuses on the southern kingdom, Judah. Elohist. E. Uses Elohim for God, emphasizes prophecy, and comes from the northern kingdom, Israel. Priestly. Pipe. Focuses on rituals, genealogy, and worship. Shows concern for order, law, and religious observance. Deuteronomic. Dio. While mostly prominent in Deuteronomy, some scholars see stylistic echoes in Genesis's legal and moral themes. Redaction. These sources were collected and woven together by later editors, redactors, creating a single, unified narrative. This process explains repetitions, for example 2 creation accounts, contrasting names for God, Yahweh in one story, Elohim in another, and differences in style and theology found throughout Genesis. Redactors aimed to preserve the theological and historical richness of each tradition while forging a coherent story for the community. Dating and context. The final form of Genesis was likely completed during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, a period when the Jewish community sought to reaffirm its identity and heritage after displacement. This context helps explain why Genesis addresses themes of identity, origins, faith, and covenant, all crucial for an exiled people reconstructing their collective memory, literary structure, and theological diversity. Genesis employs rich literary techniques such as chiasmus and parallelism, and is divided into primeval history, chapters 1 to 11, dealing with creation and universal origins, and patriarchal history, chapters 12 to 50, focusing on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the beginnings of Israel. The presence of different perspectives, sometimes emphasizing the majesty and transcendence of God, sometimes focusing on close, intimate relationships, reflects the blending of diverse traditions. Modern scholarship values Genesis as a layered text. It blends history, theology, and literature. It preserves ancient oral and written traditions. It provides foundational theological truths about God, humanity, and the nature of origins, while inviting both faith and critical inquiry into its mysteries and complexities. Literary structure and artistry 1. Sophisticated literary techniques, chiasmus. Genesis frequently uses chiasmus, a symmetrical pattern of ideas, ABCBA, to emphasize thematic unity. For example, in Genesis 6-9, the flood narrative, the sequence of events forms a chiasmus centering on God remembering Noah, underscoring divine faithfulness and covenant. Parallelism. Genesis uses parallel passages and echoed phrases to draw connections between different stories. The two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2 show parallel structure. Both describe creation, but with different emphases, one majestic and cosmic, the other intimate and relational. Motif repetition. Repetitive motifs, like sibling rivalry, journeys, promises, and dreams, bind the narratives together and invite readers to look for recurring patterns and theological implications. 2. Division into two main parts. Primeval history, Genesis 1-11, covers universal themes: creation of world/humanity, the fall, Adam/Eve, the flood, Noah, and the scattering at Babel. These stories are archetypal, setting up theological truths about God's sovereignty, human nature, sin, and judgment. Patriarchal history, Genesis 12-50, focuses on ancestral figures: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Explores the roots of Israel, God's covenant, and complex family dynamics: faith, betrayal, forgiveness. Stories like Abraham's journey, the Jacob-Esau rivalry, and Joseph's rise in Egypt provide deep character studies and ethical dilemmas. 3. Deep character development and family dynamics. The patriarchal stories are remarkable for their psychological depth. Abraham's faith and doubts, Sarah's laughter and struggles with barrenness, Isaac's passive role and conflict between his sons Esau and Jacob, Jacob's deception and transformation, his relationship with his wives and sons, Joseph's betrayals, resilience, and ultimate forgiveness of his brothers. These narratives reveal themes of alienation, reconciliation, jealousy, and providence, presenting ancient families as deeply human, full of flaws and growth. 4. Theological themes, interwoven with history and ethics. Genesis doesn't just tell what happened, but explores why, what God's purposes are, how humans respond, and how the divine plan unfolds despite human failure. Through literary artistry, recurring motifs, blessing, curse, promise, exile, return, unify the narrative and draw theological connections across generations. Readers see that history and ethics are interlinked. Choices have consequences, but God's covenant and mercy persist. 5. Literary artistry engages readers. Genesis speaks on multiple levels, richly symbolic and historical, yet deeply spiritual and ethical. Its structure invites repeated reading and reflection, making new insights emerge as motifs and patterns are recognized. Summary table aspect. Chiasmus, parallelism, motif repetition, primeval history, patriarchal history character, development, literary theological description, symmetrical structure for emphasis. Echoed lines/passages to compare ideas, recurring themes for unity and meaning. Universal beginnings, creation, fall, flood, dispersion, ancestors and family struggles, faith journey and identity, deep psychological and ethical portrayal, artistry. Link spiritual themes with lived experience and history. Example, story/technique. The flood narrative, Genesis 6-9. Two creation accounts, Genesis 1 and 2. Sibling rivalry, journeys, dreams. Adam/Eve, Noah, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph's rise, Jacob's transformation. Blessing, covenant, reconciliation. Genesis's literary artistry makes it not just an ancient document, but a sophisticated, enduring text that continues to engage readers in questions of identity, faith, and the meaning of human life. If you want examples of chiasmus, parallels, or motifs from specific chapters, I can provide those as well. Theological themes. Creation and sovereignty of God. Genesis opens with God as the sole, sovereign creator, establishing order and purpose in the universe. Genesis 1. This narrative directly challenges ancient Near Eastern mythologies, which saw creation as the result of conflicts between multiple gods. In Genesis, creation is purposeful, peaceful, and good, emphasizing one God who is absolute ruler over nature, humanity, and history. Human sin and consequence. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 describes the fall, humanity's original disobedience, which brings sin into the world. Subsequent stories, Cain and Abel, the flood, Babel, show the destructive consequences of sin, alienation, violence, judgment, and suffering. Yet, alongside these judgments, God consistently shows mercy. For example, coats of skin for Adam and Eve, the mark of Cain, the saving of Noah. Covenant and promise. Beginning with Abraham, Genesis 12, God initiates an eternal covenant, promises to bless him, make him a great nation, and bless all peoples through his descendants. This covenant shapes the entire biblical narrative, forming the foundation for Jewish and Christian theology about God's relationship with humanity and the plan of redemption. Election and faith. Genesis highlights the idea of election, God's choice of particular individuals, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, for a specific role in salvation history. The patriarch's stories reveal a faith journey, balancing obedience, doubt, and failure. God's promise prevails not because of human perfection, but through ongoing grace and fidelity, despite flaws. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, Jacob's wrestling with God, and Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers exemplify complex, evolving faith. Providence and redemption. The Joseph story, Genesis 37-50, is a profound picture of divine providence. Although Joseph is betrayed, sold, and imprisoned, God uses these circumstances to save many lives. The key theological insight: even evil actions and suffering can become instruments of greater good when guided by God's providence. Joseph concludes, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20, summarizing Genesis's message of redemption and hope. Summary table. Theme: creation and sovereignty, human sin and consequence, covenant and promise, election and faith, providence and redemption. Key example/passage: Genesis 1:1, 2:7, Genesis 3:4, 6-9, 11, Genesis 12:15, 17, Genesis 12-36, Patriarchs, Genesis 37-50, Joseph. Meaning and significance: one sovereign God, creator of all sin, leads to suffering, yet God shows mercy. God's plan to bless and redeem. Through chosen people, God's promises continue. Despite human imperfection, God's providence turns evil to good. Hope for redemption. Genesis's theological themes connect its ancient stories with timeless truths about God, humanity's condition, and the divine plan of redemption. Let me know if you want to explore specific chapters or characters in more depth. Historical and cultural context. Interaction with ancient Near Eastern literature. Genesis was written in a time and setting surrounded by ancient Near Eastern cultures, Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Canaanites, each with their own creation and flood myths. For example, Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh. While sharing motifs, such as creation and flood stories, Genesis is unique for its presentation of monotheism. Unlike myths with many gods struggling for power, Genesis asserts that one sovereign God created all things and rules the universe with purpose and order. This theological difference is clear. Genesis begins with a single, sovereign God, not a pantheon, and creates humanity with dignity and responsibility rather than as slaves to capricious deities. Identity and purpose for exiled Israel. Genesis took its final shape during or after the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE. The Israelite community faced displacement, loss of homeland, and the need to rebuild identity. Genesis's narratives provide meaning and hope, explaining the origins of the world, humanity, and especially the chosen people of Israel. Stories like the calling of Abraham, the covenant, and the patriarchs help Israel see itself as part of a divine plan, with a purpose and hope for restoration, despite suffering and exile. Archaeological and textual support. Archaeology supports many details of Genesis's settings, not always verifying every story, but confirming aspects like migration patterns, ancient cities, family structures, and customs described in the patriarchal stories. Example: Ebla tablets, 1970s, reference creation accounts and cities named in Genesis. Excavations at sites like Sodom and Gomorrah show destruction consistent with biblical accounts. Ancient migration scenes, as seen in Egyptian tomb paintings, align with Abraham's journeys. Modern scholars recognize that while Genesis interprets history with a theological lens, it draws upon real places, cultures, and events, making its story both rooted in history and rich in symbolism. Summary table: Aspect Genesis narrative, ancient Near Eastern context. Uniqueness in Genesis creation story, Genesis 1-2. Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, creation by gods. Monotheism, order. Dignity of humanity, flood narrative. Genesis 6-9. Atrahasis, Gilgamesh flood. Theological meaning, moral focus, patriarchal journeys. Abraham, Joseph, etc. Nomadic tradition, migration, archaeology, divine covenants, ethical monotheism. Identity during exile, hope, belonging, promise. Exile common in ancient empires, divine promise of restoration and purpose. Archaeological/textual studies, matching sites/customs, historical parallels and evidence. Theological interpretation with historical grounding. Genesis thus stands apart from other ancient texts, offering a vision of history shaped by faith in one God, providing hope and identity to a displaced people, and reflecting both ancient realities and profound theological insight. Let me know if you want examples from specific stories or archaeological findings. Critical challenges, apparent contradictions, and composite sources. Genesis contains passages that seem to contradict or differ from each other, most notably in the two creation accounts. Genesis 1 presents creation in 6 days, humanity last, and the cosmos-wide scope. Genesis 2 starts with the creation of man, then woman, and focuses on a garden setting. These differences reflect the work of diverse source traditions compiled to preserve theological richness, not necessarily mistakes. Other apparent contradictions in genealogy, chronology, and details are often the result of ancient editorial practice, which preserved multiple traditions to offer layered theological meaning. Textual variants. The Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, Greek, and Samaritan Pentateuch preserve thousands of textual variants in Genesis, especially in genealogies and narrative details. These result from centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation by different communities. Textual criticism reviews all extant manuscripts to identify original readings and understand the history of transmission and editorial changes. Debate on historicity. The early chapters of Genesis, creation, flood, Babel, are debated among scholars for their historical accuracy. Some see them as theological myth, stories communicating profound spiritual truths rather than literal history. Others uphold historical core events, especially in the Patriarchal Narratives. Genesis employs intricate structure, number symbolism, and poetic devices more typical of theological literature than strict historical prose. Faith and reason. Genesis invites both faith and reason to engage with the text. It encourages deep spiritual reflection while also supporting critical historical inquiry. Many scholars and faith communities treat these stories as conveying eternal truths about God, humanity, and destiny, transcending strict historical or scientific scrutiny. Summary table. Challenge example/aspect. Scholarly approach. Religious approach. Contradictions/variants. Creation accounts. Genealogies. Textual criticism. Source theory. Complementary traditions. Layered meaning. Composite sources. Yahwist, Elohist, priestly source. Critical analysis, divine inspiration through diversity, historicity debates, Genesis 1-11. Theological myth, folklore, or history. Truth conveyed spiritually, not only factually. Engagement all chapters. Critical reading/interrogation, reflection, faith, and meaning. Genesis has drawn centuries of debate and study, balancing historical, literary, and spiritual interpretation. Its complexity is an invitation, not a barrier, to deeper exploration of faith and reason together. What is critical study of Genesis, and why does it matter? The critical study of the book of Genesis means looking beyond just what the text says and exploring how and why it was written, as well as what its stories have meant to people through centuries. This approach isn't about criticizing or rejecting faith. It's about understanding Genesis in depth, using tools like history, literature, and theology. Why is this important for viewers? Deeper understanding. By studying Genesis critically, we discover layers, historical background, literary artistry, and theological ideas that aren't always obvious. We see how ancient cultures and different traditions helped shape the stories we read today. Bridging faith and scholarship. Critical study allows us to balance faith and reason. It opens new ways of appreciating the Bible both spiritually and intellectually, and encourages discussion among people from different backgrounds. Answering big questions. Genesis deals with timeless questions. Where did we come from? Why is there good and evil? What does it mean to be chosen or blessed? Critical study examines not just the answers Genesis gives, but how those answers have been interpreted and debated. Appreciating literary artistry. Genesis is crafted with symbolic patterns, repeated motifs, and dramatic storytelling, techniques like chiasmus and parallelism. Recognizing these enriches our understanding and enjoyment of the text. Cultural impact. The stories of Genesis have influenced art, music, literature, and philosophy all over the world. Critical study helps us see its impact and relevance beyond religious circles. Respect for diversity. People read Genesis in many ways, some for faith, others for curiosity or academic interest. All are welcome to explore its richness. How will we explore this together? In this video, and upcoming ones, we'll look at the historical context and ancient myths compared to Genesis, how literary structure makes stories powerful and meaningful, what theological ideas run through Genesis, like covenant, election, creation, and redemption, why scholars examine sources, forms, and editing, and what we learn from that, how faith and critical study can work together, not against each other. Studying Genesis critically opens a fascinating journey through history, storytelling, and questions that still matter today. I hope you find new insights and maybe even discover something that speaks to your own life or beliefs. If you have thoughts, questions, or topics you want to dive into next, please leave a comment. I'm excited to explore with you. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the book of Genesis. See you in the next video.